It seems like we're all kind of on the same page here, that we understand that our cultures and our ethnic backgrounds really do shape the way we see Christ and the way we see the Bible and the way we do ministry. And we've been talking about that a lot, and we're going to get into that right now. We're talking about multicultural competency, and Soong-Chan has a really good book out, The Next Evangelicalism, and he's really talking about, and he's going to get into this when he comes up here, about the way in which the modern church is becoming global and really becoming urban, that the nations are coming to the cities, how the church needs to wrestle with that and has to be relevant to that, and how people need to be Christians and leaders. Christian leaders need to be culturally competent and able to reach out to people that are from another country but are right across the street or right next door to them, okay? But the thing I'd like to talk about, to get us started, I want to do a little church history. I'm a church historian, that's my thing, I'm a nerd, and I like it a lot. And I actually think that it has a lot to tell us about how we do church today, amen? So let's be nerds together for a few minutes, and let's look at a little church history. My special focus is in the history of the early African church. We're talking about Egypt, we're talking about Ethiopia. I also study the history of the Syriac-speaking communities that brought the gospel to China and to India. So my interest is in the growth of Christianity in the early centuries among people of color. Because in some of the dynamics that we're talking about, that we're seeing now, we're talking about people of color becoming free of Western captivity and really claiming an indigenous Christian heritage. But one thing that I always want to kind of bring in to the conversation, and I do this usually when I come to Ccda or other places, is that the church, while we do need to wrestle with the 20th century and the 21st century and the globalizing of the church has been a multicultural and a multinational organism since day one. That the church has been among people of color as well as Westerners from day one. And that's why I do what I do. That's why I'm interested in it. And I'd like us to, since we don't have a whole lot of time, I'd like us to just hone in on one particular aspect of church history as a case study in multicultural incompetence and how that legacy has really has followed us all the way into today. So I want to just look specifically at the events of the Council of Chalcedon. And how many people here have heard of Chalcedon? Okay, good, most of you. So just to get just a brief overview of it, Council of Chalcedon is what the Catholic Church recognizes as the Fourth Ecumenical Council. It has a huge influence in the history of the church, and it's one of the first great schisms in the church where the church really parted ways in a major way, and a lot of that was around racial and cultural lines. Okay, up until this point, the Christianity growing in the West, in Rome and in Constantinople, as well as Christianity growing among people of color, people in Africa, like in Egypt and in Nubia and in Ethiopia, as well as in Asia, Syriac-speaking Christians, and India as well. Up until this point, the Christian church was united under the Council of Nicaea, under the Council of Constantinople, and as well as the Council of Ephesus. All right, so Ephesus brings us to 430. Chalcedon brings us to 451. This was a conference that was convened by the Roman Emperor Marcion at the time, and the issue was Christology. The issue with Christology, right? How we understand Jesus, how we interpret the person and work of Jesus Christ, who he is, and how we talk about him. And that's really what the whole thing was about. It wasn't theological. It wasn't ecumenical. It was cultural. That's the argument I'd like to make. It was a cultural argument in the sense that people had different ways of talking about the person and work of Jesus Christ. If we could have the next slide. Basically, what had happened was, up until this point, there were Christians who believed, if you guys have heard the terms Miaphysite and Diophysite, basically that refers to the natures of Christ. The church was arguing about, does Jesus have one nature or two natures? And that was the big argument, right? The colored folk, the people in Africa and in the Middle East, were arguing that Jesus was one nature. So to this day, they're called Miaphysites. Some people call them Monophysites. Don't ever call them that. That will make them very angry if you call them Monophysite. Because Monophysite means they only believe in one nature or one essence. Okay, but there's a difference there. Miaphysite means one united essence. Okay, and that's what they believe. The Catholic Church and Protestants as well have accused them of believing that Jesus didn't have a fully human side, but that's not what they were arguing. They were arguing that Jesus' human and divine nature were fused together into one nature in the incarnation. Whereas, and that was actually 20 years before the decision at Ephesus when Nestorius was excommunicated. That was the decision made. What had happened was the Eastern Church believed this so strongly that a certain Dioscorus of Alexandria had made a motion that anyone preaching that Jesus had two natures should be excommunicated. The Church of Rome got into that, and if you guys have ever heard of Leo's tome, they wrote that completely doing away with that kind of ideology. And the Eastern churches, the African and the Arab churches, were excommunicated from the church, and that's where we get the schism that exists until this day. The Oriental Orthodox churches and the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. As we all know, the Eastern Orthodox split later in the 11th century, but this was the first great schism. Okay, and the reason behind this, I mean, why does this really matter, right? It seems like a really silly argument, and it was a silly argument, okay? And there's actually been some efforts of reconciliation between different Catholic popes and different patriarchs of Alexandria, different ways of creating common declarations and creating reconciliation, because even people today realize this was a silly argument and we shouldn't have been arguing about this. And they even have admitted that this was largely a cultural argument. Because if we could have the next slide. The word for nature in physics, the word for nature in Greek is physis, all right? And the word for person is prosopon. The result of the Council of Chalcedon was that Jesus had one nature, one person, but two natures, his human and his divine nature. And those two, you guys have probably heard before, they're without separation, without confusion, without division. That was their argument, okay? The African Christians, the Arab Christians rejected this because they felt that they were saying that there was two Jesuses, that there was a divine Jesus and there was a human Jesus. So in their mind, they were upholding, when I say they, I'm talking about the what we call, when we say Oriental Orthodox, we're talking about Africa and the Middle East. The Oriental Orthodox, they felt that they were defending the original Council of Ephesus, that they were the ones defending what they had already decided. The church at large had already decided that Jesus is one, okay, and that's why they still hold to that today. It's uncertain, there's different arguments as to why the Catholic Church felt all of a sudden to put down the one nature theology and really espouse this two nature theology. But a lot of people, and I would actually weigh in on this, feel that it wasn't for theological reasons or even for cultural reasons, but it was just for political reasons. That at this time, and what did happen was Alexandria was the seat of power in the East, but after this had happened, Rome cut them off, Constantinople became the power in the East. So Alexandria, African place, as well as Antioch, Asian place, were completely reduced in power, and now the power was completely in Rome first foremost, and then Constantinople. So this was a tragic day for churches of color, because what happened was the churches in these areas, in Africa and in Asia, they were severely reduced and they were consolidated in a lot of ways. And their Christian traditions, some of which died completely. The Nubian church, for example, you guys have probably heard of Nubians before. This was a Christian group. They were worshiping Jesus Christ, but their Christian presence is almost totally gone. And Nubians today, as we see them in northern Sudan and southern Egypt, are predominantly Muslim. Other Christian groups survived, but they were severely reduced, like the Copts in Egypt. The Copts have maintained their essence, they've maintained their identity as African Christians, but Egypt's a predominantly Muslim country. Other more successful stories are Ethiopia. Ethiopia has and always has been, since the time of the early church, a Christian country, and it still is today. And they have a very indigenous, if you guys have ever, in your cities, go and visit one of these church communities. Go and visit an Ethiopian church, go visit a Coptic church. You will see the power of what indigenous black and indigenous Arab Christianity can look like, free of Western colonialism, okay? But this is tragic. This was a tragic story, because for those of us in here, especially those of us of color, we were completely cut off from this history, right? Because what happened was, once the West had cut them off and consolidated all power in Rome, and that begins the Western cultural captivity of the church. From this time on, now Christianity is seen as this Western thing, and no one in the world has ever heard of Copts or Ethiopian Tiwahedo Christians and Syrian and Malankara Indian Christians. No one hears about these things, right? We think of India, we think of Hindus, right? But there is a Christian community in India that's been there since the time of the early church, okay? So, but what happened was, we were cut off from these things. When the rise of Islam came in the 7th century, completely consolidated and in some cases decimated these Christian communities, so they didn't have the opportunity to go into the rest of Africa and into the rest of Asia and continue to spread the gospel, right? So now we have other cultures growing in these parts of the world that are seen as antithetical to Christianity, that they don't belong to Christianity. Christianity is Western Christianity, right? And so those of us today that find ourselves descendants of people of color from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, we have this heritage, most of us have this heritage of receiving Christianity from a white, Western, colonialistic way, right? And we have to now struggle, we have to wrestle with reclaiming an indigenous version of Christianity, right? But that doesn't happen. That's not the case in these Christian communities.